It was a quiet dawn in 399 BCE when the old man stood before the court of Athens, surrounded by 500 of his own fellow citizens, men who would decide if he lived or died. He wasn't a criminal. He hadn't led a rebellion or stolen a single coin. His only crime was thinking differently. His name was Socrates, and before that day was over, the world's first democracy would prove how fragile it truly was. They said he was dangerous, that his words could corrupt young minds, that his questions could tear apart the moral fabric of Athens. But if you had met him, you'd never have guessed it. He wore no fine robes, carried no sword, spoke softly, and never charged a single drachma for his lessons. He simply wandered the city's agoras, barefoot and curious, asking the kind of questions that made people uncomfortable. What is justice? What is virtue? Do you know why you believe what you believe? Most people didn't. And that was the problem, because Athens, the so-called birthplace of freedom, had just emerged from chaos. The Peloponnesian War had ended in disaster. Their empire was broken, their navy crushed, and their pride shattered by Sparta. And when desperate men are searching for someone to blame, even the wisest voices can sound like threats. In the ruins of defeat, the Athenians had lost more than their power. They had lost their certainty. And in that void, fear took root. Fear of outsiders. Fear of critics. Fear of men like Socrates. The charges came swiftly, wrapped in words of moral outrage, corrupting the youth of Athens. Failing to acknowledge the gods of the city, two men stood as his accusers. Anytus, a powerful politician and defender of traditional Athens, and Miletus, a young poet eager to make a name for himself. But behind them was something far more dangerous than ambition. It was vengeance. Years earlier, Athens had suffered under a brutal regime called the 30 Tyrants, an oligarchy supported by Sparta that executed hundreds of citizens. Among those tyrants had been Critias, a former student of Socrates. The people remembered. And now, though Critias was long dead, his teacher would pay the price. As the trial began, thousands gathered outside the court. Some whispered that this was justice, that the man who questioned everything now stood before the only question that mattered, life or death. Others watched in silence, knowing that if Socrates fell, truth itself would be on trial. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. The jurors sat on wooden benches, murmuring as the old philosopher rose to speak in his defense. No lawyer stood beside him. He refused one. "I'm not here to beg for mercy," he said calmly. "I am here to speak the truth." He began not with anger, but with irony, the same gentle weapon that had made him so feared. He questioned Miletus, his accuser, just as he always questioned others. "You claim I corrupt the youth. Tell me, Miletus, who improves them?" Miletus replied, "The laws, the jurors, the citizens, all of Athens." Socrates smiled faintly. "So, everyone improves them, except me? How strange. Do you see no contradiction?" The crowd stirred. Even now, even facing death, he was turning the trial into another lesson, exposing ignorance with calm precision. But this was not the agora. This was not the open air of reason. This was a courtroom hungry for punishment. As he spoke, the echoes of war still haunted the city. Athens was tired of being questioned, tired of doubt. They wanted certainty, unity, and in a way, Socrates represented everything they had come to fear. He had mocked their politicians for claiming wisdom they did not possess. He had questioned their gods, their pride, their victories, even their definition of justice. To them, he was not a philosopher. He was a reminder of how easily democracy could collapse from within. And yet, as his speech went on, something remarkable happened. Socrates began to sound less like a man on trial, and more like a man giving judgment on his accusers. "You fear the truth because it unmasks your ignorance," he said. "I will not change to make you comfortable. Even if you kill me, there will be others who ask the same questions, because it is not me you are fighting. It is wisdom itself. Some jurors shifted uneasily. Others scowled. The people of Athens had once prided themselves on debate, but now they wanted silence. In the end, the jurors voted. The decision was close, 281 to 220, but it was enough. Socrates was found guilty. The court then offered him a chance. He could propose his own punishment. Death or something else. It was an opening meant for compromise, for humility, for begging forgiveness. But Socrates didn't beg. He smiled. "For my crimes," he said, "I propose that I be rewarded, fed at the public's expense, as are the victors of the Olympic Games." A roar of outrage filled the chamber. He had just mocked the court at his own sentencing. It was over. The second vote came swiftly, and this time the verdict was death. Outside, the crowd was silent. No cheers, no cries. Just the cold realization that Athens, the mother of democracy, had just condemned one of her own greatest minds. They said he would die by drinking poison hemlock. But before that final act, Socrates would speak one last time and leave behind words so mysterious, so haunting, that they would echo across 2,000 years. The prison cell was quiet. A narrow beam of sunlight stretched across the stone floor, where Socrates sat calmly, not as a man awaiting death, but as a teacher preparing for one last lesson. 3 days had passed since his sentence. His friends had begged him to flee. They had money, influence, and plans to smuggle him out of Athens. One of them, Crito, whispered desperately, "They will kill you, Socrates. You owe it to your children. Escape while you can." But Socrates only smiled. "My dear Crito," he said, "I owe more to truth than to life." He would not run, because to run, he said, would betray everything he had ever taught. And so, in that quiet cell, the man who defied Athens prepared to meet death on his own terms. Outside, the city stirred uneasily. The trial of Socrates had shaken Athens to its core. Some saw it as justice. Others saw it as a moral wound, proof that democracy, when consumed by fear, could destroy its own foundation. The philosopher Plato, who had been too young to defend his master, wrote later that the city committed a crime against philosophy itself. For in condemning Socrates, Athens had turned its back on the very freedom of thought it once celebrated. But inside the prison, there was no bitterness, only strange serenity. As the sun began to set, Socrates' followers gathered. Among them were Apollodorus, who wept uncontrollably, and Phaedo, who would later record every moment of that night. Socrates greeted them as though nothing unusual were about to happen. He spoke of the soul, of death, of immortality, his voice soft, his eyes clear. He told them that death was not an end, but a liberation, the separation of the soul from the body, the moment when wisdom is finally free from illusion. To his students, his calmness was unbearable. Phaedo later wrote, "He seemed so happy in his death that I could hardly believe he was dying." But then came a knock at the cell door. A guard entered, carrying a small clay cup filled with a cloudy liquid. Hemlock, the poison of execution in Athens. It worked slowly, numbing the body, climbing from the feet to the heart, until life slipped quietly away. The guard looked uneasy. He had seen men curse, scream, and beg before drinking it. But not this man, not Socrates. The old philosopher took the cup in his hands, raised it slightly, and said something that silenced everyone in the room. "Let us go, as we must, to our destiny. The hour calls." He drank. No hesitation, no fear, only peace. Minutes passed. He walked a few steps, then lay down, covering himself with a thin blanket. He instructed his friend Crito to wait until his legs went numb before touching him. Slowly, the poison crept upward, first his feet, then his legs. He pinched his thigh and said quietly, "It is cold." Those were his last physical sensations. Then, just before the numbness reached his chest, He opened his eyes one final time and said to Crito, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it is paid." Then he stopped breathing, and in that moment, Athens lost more than a man. It lost its mirror. For centuries, philosophers have puzzled over that final sentence. We owe a cock to Asclepius. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, to whom people offered a rooster as thanks for a cure. But what did Socrates mean? What sickness had been healed? What cure had been given? Some believe he meant that death itself was the cure, that life, with all its illusions, was the disease, and the soul's release was a kind of healing. Others say he meant that Athens had been sick, poisoned by ignorance and pride, and that his death was the medicine that would one day awaken her conscience. Either way, those words weren't of despair. They were a message, a final riddle from the man who had built his entire life on questions. The next morning, the city was silent. Even those who had voted for his death felt uneasy. Something sacred had been broken, something that could not be repaired by law or politics. The trial that was meant to protect Athens had exposed its weakness. A democracy that could not tolerate criticism was no democracy at all. Plato, in his grief, began to write. From those writings, Apology, Phaedo, Crito, Republic, a new vision of justice began to take form. He vowed never again to let truth be at the mercy of opinion. And from his words, the idea of philosophy as we know it was born. Socrates was gone, but his trial had lit a spark that would one day define Western thought. Through Plato, through Aristotle, through centuries of thinkers who followed, the questions that Athens had silenced refused to die, because in killing him, the city had unwittingly made him immortal. Yet beneath the admiration and the myth, one haunting thought remained. Had Athens realized too late that the death of one man could threaten the survival of democracy itself? And if democracy could be destroyed by fear of truth, what does that say about our own world today? Years passed. Athens moved on, or at least pretended to. But deep in the heart of the city, a silence lingered. A silence where questions used to echo. And that silence, more than anything, marked the wound Socrates had left behind. The democracy of Athens had survived wars, plagues, and revolutions, but could not escape the shadow of that trial. When future generations looked back, they didn't see a triumph of justice. They saw the moment when a free city punished free thought, when democracy, in its fear, had become the very thing it once swore to destroy. The philosopher Plato never forgave the city. He left Athens soon after Socrates' death, disgusted and disillusioned. In his writings, he would turn that heartbreak into vision, a vision that shaped the entire Western world. He wrote of a world of forms, of truth beyond opinion, of philosopher kings who ruled not by popularity, but by wisdom. To Plato, democracy had failed because it handed power to emotion rather than reason, to crowds rather than conscience. He described it as a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, where citizens live as they please until freedom devours itself. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato painted a warning that unchecked democracy becomes tyranny, that when truth becomes unpopular, the mob becomes the judge. And he had proof. He had seen it. He had watched the most enlightened city on earth execute its wisest man out of fear. Meanwhile, in Athens, life returned to normal. Merchants sold their wares in the agora again. Young men debated politics, unaware of the irony that the ground beneath them had condemned the greatest questioner of all. Statues of gods and heroes gleamed in the sun, but none bore the face of Socrates. It was as if the city wanted to erase him, to pretend the trial had never happened. But ideas don't die with their authors. They travel, they infect, they haunt, and soon, those ideas began to seep back into the very heart of Athenian thought. Socrates' students kept his memory alive. Plato in Athens, Xenophon in Asia, and countless others who whispered his words to new ears. Over time, Athens realized what it had done. Centuries later, even Roman philosophers looked back in shame. Cicero called Socrates the father of philosophy. Others saw him as a martyr of reason, a man who had died, not for religion or rebellion, but for the right to ask questions. And yet, the deeper tragedy remains. His death wasn't ordered by a tyrant. It was voted by citizens, ordinary men, who believed they were protecting democracy. That's what makes the story so terrifying. Socrates wasn't killed by dictatorship. He was killed by democracy itself. The trial of Socrates became more than history. It became a mirror. Every age that claims to love freedom must eventually look into it. And when they do, they face the same question that haunted Athens. What happens when truth becomes dangerous? When ideas threaten comfort? When speaking freely makes you the enemy? Those who judge Socrates' jurors too harshly forget how human they were, afraid, uncertain, desperate to protect their fragile order. In their eyes, silencing one voice seemed safer than questioning everything. But that one voice, that single life, was the foundation of everything democracy was meant to be. In the centuries that followed, empires rose and fell. Rome, Byzantium, the kingdoms of Europe, each claimed to value wisdom, each feared dissent, and each, in its own way, repeated Athens' mistake. But Socrates' spirit endured. His questions became the seeds of reason, ethics, and science. They reached the Renaissance, inspired the Enlightenment, and shaped the very principles that define modern freedom. Because even as Athens tried to erase him, the world remembered his last act of defiance, the courage to face death with truth on his lips. Today, more than 2,000 years later, we still debate his words. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Maybe it was his way of saying, thank you for the cure. That death, or truth, had finally healed him from the sickness of ignorance. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was his last warning, that every society which forgets the cost of truth will one day need healing again. Because the trial of Socrates was never just about one man. It was a test of democracy's soul. And the verdict, though centuries old, still hangs over us all. What happens when a nation built on free speech begins to fear the sound of its own voice? What happens when questioning becomes a crime again? The Athenians learned that answer too late.